Welcome to Hope's Garden and the Bridegroom Speaks podcast with Laura Ercolino.
This is Father Michael Stalla, the spiritual advisor for Hope's Garden, and today I'd like to talk to you about theology of the body. Just a brief introduction. This teaching of theology of the body comes from the teachings of Pope John Paul II, who is now a saint of the Church. He wanted to explore the understanding of why we are man and woman, what was God's intention with creating us as two different genders, but more than that, then what does it mean about our relationships, about marriage, about us as individual people in our understanding of ourselves in the context of a community. So I can only do a brief understanding about this because it would take volumes, it would take weeks and weeks and probably years of study in order to read all that there is to learn about it. One of the theologians who has brought much attention to theology of the body here in the United States is Christopher West. And so a lot of the teachings that I have really stem from his teachings as he began to put it into context of our American experience and the examples of our lives, what it means to apply the theology of the body. Well, let's start from the beginning. There's a group of people that come up to Jesus and they say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And Jesus says, well, what does Moses have to say about it? And they say, well, Moses said it was allowed. You could write a bill of divorce. Jesus says, it is true that Moses gives you permission, but he gives you permission because of your hardness of heart. But since the beginning, I tell you, it was not so. Well, what's he talking about? So in the beginning, he's referring to Adam and Eve. He's talking about the plan that God had for humanity. And God designed us in such a way that we would be complementary to one another, that we would be helpful to one another, that we would enrich each other's lives so that men and women were made for each other. And it wasn't God's intention that we would end in divorce, which is not surprising to us. After all, who would ever get married intending to get divorced? That is not our plans either. It is a sadness. It is some sort of level of failure on the human condition that we do often end in divorce. And Jesus describes it as a hardness of heart, that when our hearts become hardened, they're no longer pliable. You know, when we are soft-hearted, we have strong feelings. And he understands that because of the pains that we have experienced, sometimes we try to defend our hearts. And when somebody offends us, which is going to happen here on earth, it's going to happen throughout our lifetime, when somebody offends us, especially something so sensitive and intimate as those we trust most, those that we love, those who are in our families, a husband and a wife, that can create a hardness of heart where we stop being able to forgive one another. We stop being willing to risk intimacy, letting somebody in to then affect us in a very serious way. So he says that's hardness of heart. And because of your hardness of heart, because you just couldn't seem to get past the fact that we are vulnerable, that we are fragile, and that other people sometimes do offend us, you no longer have hope that marriage, that complementarity can continue. So what is Jesus saying here as we apply it to our day today? He's saying, I want you to really get married for the right reasons. I want you to treat your marriage as something holy and sacred. I need you to work on developing that understanding of marriage and kind of stray away from some of the tendencies we have of following the advice of this world or putting up with a false understanding of marriage. In the story of creation, Adam was placed in the garden, chapter 2 of Genesis, and everything was given to him as a gift. And yet, Adam found himself very lonely. He found himself longing for someone with whom to share the eternity with, the paradise he was given. And God realized that Adam is the top of the food chain. He's unlike any other creature. But that does make him feel lonely. So he gives him a helpmate taken from his rib and formed out of his own flesh and bone is one equal to him, yet distinct in a very important way. And that Adam, according to John Paul II, was so excited to see this new creature, he fell in love with her right away. Her beauty drew him to her. But more than that, he now saw an equal with him. It wasn't another object that was just a gift for him to use. This was a person, someone with whom he could share. In fact, Adam saw himself as a gift that found nobody worthy of the gift of himself until he met Eve. John Paul II would go as far as to say, it wasn't paradise until Eve arrived. The woman, the masterpiece of God's work. And Eve, of course, has central to her identity that she is supposed to be a gift for him. Now, if that's the end of the story, we'd say, well, then how come our world, our relationships, our experiences don't match what was the intention of God? Well, we'd say, well, chapter 3 of Genesis, sin enters into the picture. You know, the serpent, he's not supposed to come into the garden, but Adam doesn't know to defend against the serpent yet. He's never had a temptation. And Eve doesn't know you don't talk to the tempter. You know, you can see right there that already we're dealing with a type of poetry, an imagery. I mean, snakes don't talk, we know this, but it's really the devil, and it's probably more of an internal voice rather than an external voice, but it's not coming from themselves. It's coming from some spiritual outside reality that is now starting to attack them. And Adam should have defended against the serpent. Don't let those things into your family, into your home. But he doesn't know better. He really doesn't. He imagines that all creatures, all realities are somehow safe. But he doesn't know this is a poison. Of course, Eve doesn't know this either. And when Eve speaks to the serpent kind of tricks her by saying something that he knows is wrong. Absolutely knows is wrong. Is it true that you can't eat from any of the trees of the garden? Well, he knows that's wrong. He's not actually asking a question. He's just trying to get into her mind. And she entertains this. She says, no, that's not true. We're allowed to eat from any of the trees. Well, except for that one. That one, if we ate from that tree, it is the knowledge of good and evil. And we will surely die. And then, of course, the serpent said, you're not going to die. Knowledge is power, and God's trying to keep you down. If you had knowledge, you'd be like gods. And so she begins not to trust God's plan, God's motivations. She wants to follow her impulse over the law given by God. And she eats of the forbidden fruit. And, of course, Adam does too, because he's doesn't even say anything. They're kind of like doing this together. She was just the spokesperson of the moment. And the result of the sin, the very first thing is they noticed that they were naked. Apparently they'd been naked up to this point, and it's not like they were blind to that nakedness. Adam saw how beautiful she was and was drawn to her. And same with Eve, I'm sure, as she was drawn to his beauty. But now, seeing their nakedness, they feel an insecurity. Like you're looking at me, not with the respect of who I am, but as an object, with something that should be manipulated and used. You're looking at me like everything else in the garden. But I'm not like anything else. I'm a person worthy of respect. Because of this, John Paul II says this is the main problem with pornography. Pornography is taking a person and making them into an object that is pleasing to the eyes, that is somehow brings about in us this desire for the flesh, but not really seeing the fullness of the person. He says the problem with pornography isn't that it shows too much, but that it shows too little of the actual person. And you can see the role of clothing at that point is to put on dignity so that you see the real me and that you're not distracted by these other things that become desires, but that you see the person who's not a thing, a person who is worthy of a respect, and not just somebody that you take from, but somebody that you can be a gift to. So this gifting to one another becomes the complementarity. In fact, God had designed us so you couldn't live alone. You know, nobody has all the gifts. Every time you find that you're lacking in some way, maybe you're not very good at mathematics, maybe you can tend to be more emotional and therefore having a difficult time making decisions because your emotions kind of take over, or you're seeing that I just step on people's toes, I say the wrong thing at the wrong time. Every single time you find something that you're lacking in becomes an opportunity to invite somebody into your life to balance you out, to complement you. Our goal is not for us to then start thinking that way, to say, okay, well, we're going to become Superman. That's not the goal, but how do we work as a community? And in a particular way, for the understanding of myself as a man, I need to have a woman in that relationship. And for marriage, we might even say, well, a man by himself could never have children, and a woman by herself could never have children. They need each other, and that God wrote it physically on their bodies like a lock and key. And we even look like a lock and key, that they fit together perfectly so that something could be unlocked that otherwise would not be accessible. And so the act of becoming a gift for somebody else really brings about the fullness of who you were meant to be as God originally intended it. But it does require us to avoid that tempter, avoid that desire of putting a person as a thing that I use, and remember that they are a person worthy of the gift of who I am. That is considered a blessing. Right in the beginning, God blesses man and woman and says, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. How many times do people now think about our sexuality as being somehow distinct from fruitfulness? And looking at fruitfulness, having kids, getting pregnant, as being a curse of some sort. Something that should be avoided at all costs. And that we should seek the pleasure, but not the responsibility. John Paul II would be saying, no, keep those two together. Always keep them together. And if you don't, if you think, well, with modern science and the ways that we can handle things, we can separate those two, there are consequences to that that you might not have considered. All you thought was, I will get pleasure, and I will not have children, so I won't have responsibility, I won't have consequences. But you miss the fact that the act of kind of betraying the purpose of our sexuality, the purpose of being a man and of being a woman in relationship to each other, we end up breaking each other's hearts. And we could feel it very deeply. It feels like a betrayal on the deepest level. We begin to lose a sense of our own dignity. We begin to feel like, am I just an object? Not only trying to defend ourselves to say, I'm not an object, I'm a person, but starting to believe it. Maybe it's just a transactional relationship. Maybe I offer you this, you offer me that, and that's the end of this relationship. Instead of seeing the beauty of what God intended, that you would find the fullness of your dignity. So the clothing that they put on was not really meant to say, I need to hide myself because I am not dignified. But that I'm having a hard time seeing you and you seeing me as the dignified person I am. So being clothed, we use this imagery throughout the scriptures, is kind of a way of saying, I'm putting your dignity back on you. And think of somebody being given royal clothing, and they're just, bedecked in jewels. Or if you have the prodigal son, and he comes home and his father throws a cloak around him. And he doesn't do so to hide him. He does so to lift up his dignity, so that when people see them, they don't see this poor, wretched man, but that they recognize him as the son of the Father. And so there's a deep sense of the clothing that God then gives them is to restore a dignity that had been lost in some way. Unfortunately, we continue to fall into this pattern with the original sin. But then in the modern day sins, we have this idea that we can separate sex and love, sex and family, sex and the responsibility we have for each other, and that it has less and less to do with the actual being a gift for each other, and more to do with what I can get from somebody, the manipulations that happen. And we see this, in the way that we do our advertisements, in a hookup culture. And then it starts to kind of enter into marriages where people think, well, now we're married, I can do whatever I want with you. And that, of course, was not God's intention. And if you're not pleasing to me, then I have a right to walk away because you're not doing your part of the transaction. I'm not pleased. I'm going to go find somebody who does what I want. And again, Jesus said, you could see that's a hardness of heart. And the more that the other person continues to either play along with it or resist it, you have like these two different worldviews about what marriage was supposed to be. And one can get resentful. Why do you keep treating me like an object? With the other one saying, why do you keep denying me the things that I want? And that is kind of a breakdown of what marriage was meant to be. And this is, of course, what leads to divorce. It's not always about sexuality, but it is a sense of this like power structure. You think about it, Adam and Eve, why did they want to be like God? Why did they want knowledge of good and evil and to somehow doubt that God wanted only what was good for them? And why did they want to break the rules so that they could like surpass their current nature? It's a power struggle. And the tempter is constantly trying to poke at them to say, do you really trust God? Do you really think that this is all you could be? Don't you think you could go beyond what you are currently? And so I think there's a place for ambition to work toward the fullness of who we are. But Jesus would say, God's plan from the beginning was that you would be a gift for each other, and that will bring out the best of who you are. But once you try to get into this dominating one another, who's really in charge and who's using who, and the old resentments that kind of kick in because we feel betrayed, divorce is going to happen out of a hardness of heart. You begin to try to defend yourself from ever being hurt again. And I suppose that's like the truth of our reality in our relationships is there's a lot of pain. It's not a fairy tale. Every time that you let somebody come real close to you, there are times in which they're not careful with that. And Jesus has given us a kind of a new way of approaching this. I want you to aim toward being tender and loving and, sometimes merciful. But he doesn't want you to do that to the extent of saying, I want you to separate love and responsibility. That's not acceptable. Or to say, well, I love you, so I'll let you use me. No. Or I love you, so I'll manipulate the situation so that I'll be happy, and that'll be love. That's not the same thing. And besides that, you never actually end up happy. I mean, relationships that are like that just become toxic very quickly. So this is what we're seeing in our modern days. A lot of marriages influenced by a culture around them begin to look for goals that were not the original intention that God had for man and woman in their relationship with each other. And it becomes a power struggle, and eventually it disintegrates and breaks apart out of a sense of defending ourselves, defending our own dignity that we feel is being violated. And Jesus, on one level, you'd say, well, is he saying we should never get divorced? He doesn't actually say that. What he says to us is that was not God's intention. And to kind of draw us back to God's intention rather than who is right, who is wrong, who is righteous, who is guilty. But draw us back to God's original intention. And I really believe that if couples, from the time that they're dating, from the time they're young, had approached romantic relationships with that mindset, what is God's intention? What is the beautiful vision he's giving us? We would have far healthier marriages, far healthier families, far healthier sense of ourselves. And it is now a work trying to repair a lot of the damage that has already happened in us from the time where we were young, from the culture continuing to feed us these lies, from the tempter who continued to poke at us. And so we are kind of working against the stream here. We are trying to do something countercultural. And John Paul II pointed it out to say, this is poisonous. We need to get the poison out of us. And the key to doing that is going back to what God originally intended for man and woman, for your happiness, for your dignity, for a sense of being a gift, complementary gifts for each other. God bless you all.
For more resources and our consecration to Christ the Bridegroom, visit hopesgarden.com, the sanctuary where the spousal love of Christ the Bridegroom heals hearts, marriages, and families. You may also want to join our community powered by Mighty Networks. Download the Mighty Networks app and find us at Hope's Garden.